to this point in our series on the idea of goodness, we have rather taken goodness as something to be strived for, something positive. The questions then just focus on, and have just focused on, what goodness is, how it is best to be conceived, how it manifests itself in human actions, in art, whether science promotes or interferes with the good, and so on. Today we want to turn a more critical eye on goodness itself, and I'm delighted to be joined in this endeavour by two treasured colleagues from the College of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Gilmore-Grier, PhD from UC San Diego and Professor of Philosophy here at USD. Dr. Grier will be talking to us today about Friedrich Nietzsche's ferocious attack upon the concept of goodness. And Dr. Jesse Mills, again, PhD from UC San Diego, very well represented today, and Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies. Dr. Mills will be addressing what the important perspective of decolonization might reveal about our idea of goodness. I want to start us off, however, by looking at a tradition of thought that denies the goodness of the world altogether. And this is that tradition known as pessimism. And the contours of this tradition can perhaps best be seen in the style of pessimism's rejection both of the biblical account of creation and of the optimistic philosophy of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Sarah, can I have the first slide, please? So here we have in the first book of Genesis, we find God creating the world in 6 days and resting on the seventh. And after each day-long creative work, God surveys what he has done and declares that it is good. At the end of the sixth day, when everything has been made, we're told this: and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. The goodness of all creation is an idea that flows seamlessly, really, from the notion that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. After all, how could an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God create a world that could in any way be improved upon? This intuition forms the basis of the cosmic optimism of Leibniz. Here's Leibniz, a man who really knew how to wear a periwig. And his optimism is expressed very clearly in his classic work, The Monadology, which we're both bizarre fans of. He says, now as there is an infinite number of possible universes in the ideas of God, and as only one can exist, there must be a sufficient reason for God's choice, determining him to one rather than to another. And this reason can only be found in the fitness or in the degrees of perfection which these worlds contain. And it is this which causes the existence of the best, which God knows through his wisdom, chooses through his goodness, and produces through his power. In short, and famously, this world is the best of all possible worlds. Very famous formulation, the best of all possible worlds. Here's where we enter, I've got this wrong here. Here, Arthur Schopenhauer. It's a great photograph of Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer found all of this absolutely appalling. The optimistic view of the world was, he thought, not merely absurd, I'm quoting Schopenhauer, not merely absurd, but also a really wicked way of thinking. This is optimism, such a sort of fluffy or bubblegummy sort of thing. That to call optimism wicked seems counterintuitive. But what Schopenhauer thought of optimism was that it was, I quote, a bitter mockery of the unspeakable suffering of humanity. This point has a degree of weight, I think. If we declare that the world is good, and in Leibnizian terms, the best of all possible worlds, then we seem to be engaged in a brutal and unfeeling denial of the dreadful pain experienced on a daily basis by humans and, of course, by non-human animals. And that pain really is extensive. For Schopenhauer, attention to that pain reveals, for him at least, that this can't be the best of all possible worlds. In a wonderful rhetorical flourish, Schopenhauer actually calls this the worst of all possible worlds. That there cannot be a world worse than the one we inhabit. As an aside, it's probably worth noting the origins of these words, optimism and pessimism. They embody this contrast between the best and the worst. Optimum, of course, best. Pessimus, worst. Now, pessimism need not be of that extreme form. It simply involves the linked ideas that existence is not an unqualified good, that happiness is hard, if not impossible, to attain, that human life is in some degree absurd, that historical progress is something of an illusion, and that each one of our lives is going to end pretty horribly. Pascal's words from the Pensées, transcribed as incorrectly, there's a word missing, but Pascal beautifully said, the last act is bloody, however fine the rest of the play. They throw earth over your head, and it is finished forever. Merry Christmas. Let's return to God's verdict on his creation. Creation, God judges, is very good. Schopenhauer reads that with a profound sense of indignation. Here's Schopenhauer again. And now listen to how Schopenhauer compares that biblical account of creation, it's very good, with rival religious versions of creation. This is a long quotation, but it's perfect, pure Schopenhauer. So, all together now. Brahma is said to have produced the world by a kind of fall or mistake, and in order to atone for his folly, he is bound to remain in it himself until he works out his redemption. So he's describing a Hindu tradition. As an account of the origin of things, that's admirable. According to the doctrines of Buddhism, the world came into being as the result of some inexplicable disturbance in the heavenly calm of nirvana, which had endured so long a time, the change taking place by a kind of fatality. Subsequently, by a series of moral errors, the world became gradually worse and worse until it assumed the dismal aspect it wears today. Excellent. The Greeks looked upon the world and the gods as the work of an inscrutable necessity, a passable explanation. We may be content with it until we get a better. Again, Ormuzd and Ahriman, this is a reference to Zoroastrianism, are rival powers continually at war. That's not bad. But that a god like Jehovah should have created this world of misery and woe out of pure caprice, and because he enjoyed doing it, and then should have clapped his hands in praise of his own work and declared everything to be very good, that will not do at all. This is a great, sustained piece of critical writing, I think. He's getting much Schopenhauer. He's such a miserable man, but he's always enjoying himself.
He's positively cheerful about it.
He's a sort of funny comedian type figure. So, what is it that's so bad about this world? For Schopenhauer, the answer to that question, of course, lies in the amount of suffering experienced, an amount which outbalances and indeed overwhelms sensations and states of happiness and pleasure. This comes over well, I think, in a very remarkable passage from the Parega and Paralipomena, where he says, if you can imagine, insofar as it is approximately possible, and you should think through this yourselves. I mean, we have happy little lives up here on the mesa, enjoying ourselves. But he's asking us to take this large view of the nature of the world, everything that goes on in it on a daily basis to suffering creatures. If you can imagine, insofar as it is approximately possible, the sum total of distress, pain, and suffering of every kind, which the sun shines upon in its course, you will have to admit it would have been much better if the sun had been able to call up the phenomenon of life as little on the earth as on the moon, and if here as there the surface was still in a crystalline condition. What he's wishing is that there's no sentient life at all. This tradition goes back to Sophocles and the idea that it's better never to have been born. Well, what seems to float off the surface of this remark is not that the world, though, is bad in and of itself. I mean, the moon is a pretty extraordinary thing, after all. Schopenhauer's idea seems to be that the badness of things is relational in character. In other words, the badness of things is the consequence of a clash or a mismatch between the world, on the one hand, and the needs and desires of human beings on the other. And it's this clash and mismatch which, in fact, constitute the heart of the pessimistic tradition. There's a very interesting professor at UCLA, Joshua Foe-Dienstag, who's in the political science department, wrote a fascinating book on pessimism. And he refers to this clash very neatly, I think, as, I quote, the ontological misalignment between human beings and the world they inhabit. There's a misalignment between this world and us, and that's what badness comes from that. I want to note two different versions of this account of ontological misalignment. Schopenhauer himself gives us one of these. Schopenhauer's version of this misalignment thesis comes up in a wonderful line, a very memorable, quotable line, where he says, human life must be some kind of mistake. This is a fantastic and shocking description. We think about human life as being an expression of dignity or something near miraculous. But Schopenhauer isn't. It's just it's an error, a kind of transient little error that popped up in the world and then hopefully will disappear soon. When Schopenhauer refers to human life as a mistake, what he means is that human beings are made up of a compound of needs and desires that are very hard to satisfy. When those desires are not satisfied, we experience suffering. I mean, that probably is a pretty good description of suffering. It's your desires not being satisfied. Interestingly for Schopenhauer, whenever those desires are satisfied, as does occasionally, sometimes happen, we do not actually arrive at a state of happiness, but rather at a state of boredom, and seek something else to desire and pursue. Life therefore oscillates between active suffering and boredom, both of which are unpleasant, both of which testify against the goodness of existence, Schopenhauer says. Schopenhauer's a great writer about the nature of boredom. There's a lot of writing about boredom now. People say that we experience in modern life an epidemic of boredom. But Schopenhauer's one of the great writers on this topic. He says, if life were possessed of any positive intrinsic value, there would be no such thing as boredom at all. Mere existence would satisfy us in itself. So just sitting around doing nothing would be the best of all things. Most of us find that intolerable and insufferable. Now, as if this weren't bleak enough, Schopenhauer also reverses a familiar Christian understanding of the good-evil distinction. In that conception, stemming from St. Augustine, creation is a positive good and evil is simply an absence of good. Schopenhauer, as I say, reverses that completely. Pain is what is actually felt. Hence, the bedrock of reality is painful, bad, evil. What we call good is just a temporary abatement or absence of pain and evil. To say this is good for Schopenhauer is something really just like an expression of relief. Things have stopped hurting for a while. That's all that this is good means. Ontological misalignment is also uppermost in Sigmund Freud's... this is a great picture of Freud. Sort of an old and disgruntled cat. Freud, among other things, offers a profoundly pessimistic conception of the human condition. And one of the most fundamental convictions of the Freudian outlook, of course, is that the human mind consists predominantly of wishes. For the Freudian, we are not the rational inquirers beloved of philosophers and scientists, but wish-driven, desire-driven creatures motivated by pleasure. This is the famous pleasure principle, of course. And we largely operate with a conception of the world, not as we actually experience it, but as we want it to be. Our dreams, Freud famously contends, of course, reveal this most explicitly. Freed from the pressures of waking life, the dreaming mind produces vivid narratives powered by our unfulfilled wishes. This is why Freud says all dreams are wish fulfillment. The mental dominance of wishes and of the pleasure principle also accounts, he thinks, for the prevalence and tenacity of religious belief. For Freud, there really is no evidence that a loving God exists. Of course not. The world is too dreadful to support such a belief. For Freud, people believe in a loving God because they want such a being to exist, because they want to be unconditionally loved, and loved by a being powerful enough to look after them. Now, it's precisely this idea of the human as a pleasure-seeking, wish-driven creature that forms the basis and the spine of Freud's pessimism. Ontological misalignment is uppermost in this passage from Civilization and its Discontents, a great book. What decides the purpose of life is simply the program of the pleasure principle. And yet its program is at loggerheads with the whole world. There is no possibility at all of its being carried through. All the regulations of the universe run counter to it. One feels inclined to say that the intention that man should be happy is not included in the plan of creation. Here you have a prime version of the ontological misalignment thesis. We know what human beings want. They want to be happy. But unfortunately, we have found ourselves in a universe incapable of delivering that happiness to us. To use an analogy, it is as though a student wanted to major in philosophy and yet found herself at a university in which, imagine, one could only major in business administration. Dissatisfaction and unhappiness would follow from that. But in that case, one could, of course, transfer to a different or to a better university. Our problem is that there's no hope at all of us transferring to a better world. We're stuck with this one. Hence our predicament, hence our suffering. Now, a weighty part of Freud's analysis focuses upon the relative ease of experiencing suffering as opposed to experiencing happiness. Happiness, he thinks, is hard to experience. It requires a lot of planning, and it's possible only as an episodic phenomenon. It comes and goes. Unhappiness, on the other hand, is much easier to experience. We are threatened with suffering, he says, from three directions. The external world, as earthquakes and hurricanes, all the way down to those microscopic organisms that cause illness and disease. That's the external world. That's out to get us. Other people are also out to get us, and their nastiness can cause us to curse our lives. And finally, even if you escape all of that stuff, your own bodies are fundamentally short-lived and bring with them a large array of pains as they age and decay. Of course, it's very telling that I don't need to enumerate all these difficulties. We all know what they are. This is what the dreadful nature of life can be. Freud now says this: it is no wonder if, under the pressure of these possibilities of suffering, men are accustomed to moderate their claims to happiness. If a man thinks himself happy, merely to have escaped unhappiness or to have survived his suffering, and if in general the task of avoiding suffering pushes obtaining pleasure into the background. Now, there are a number of interesting suggestions packed into that remark. Freud's most distinctive thought, articulated in Civilization and its Discontents, is that human beings utilize a number of techniques, notably intoxication, by means of which the sufferings of life can be softened, existence can be endured. Now, that, of course, is a somewhat desperate picture. But the idea of moderating one's claims to happiness might have a more positive application. Ontological misalignment, as we've seen, results from the clash between human desires and the cold indifference of the world. This is what doesn't fit together well. Since the cold indifference of the world cannot be changed, then perhaps human beings, by altering their attitude and their expectations, can arrive at some kind of accommodation. This idea, I think, is uppermost in John Stuart Mill's idea of happiness. Here's Mill. I love this picture again. Mill offers a far more reasonable view of the nature of happiness than Freud does. See, Freud says that happiness, and this is where, Mike, I've heard you talk about this very, very interestingly. Happiness for Freud is just intense and prolonged physical pleasure. And I pointed out Mike Kelly because I've heard Mike say that you find the most enjoyable physical pleasure you could think of. And if you keep that going for hours and hours and hours, it would become unpleasant. So this is an unrealistic conception of happiness. Mill has a very different conception. Mill thinks it's entirely unrealistic to think that a happy life could consist of a continuity of highly pleasurable excitement. He says instead, what is meant by happiness is not a life of rapture, but moments of such in an existence made up of few and transitory pains, many and various pleasures, with a decided predominance of the active over the passive, and having as the foundation of the whole, and this is what I want to emphasize, not to expect more from life than it is capable of bestowing. Now that seems to me about right. If one approaches life and the world with a lowered and more realistic set of expectations, disappointments should be fewer, suffering would be less surprising, and a judgment that the world is in some sense good might be even less jarring. This is all fairly sort of sad stuff, but with that I want us to turn our attention to a philosopher who produced his thoughts somewhat in opposition or reaction to Schopenhauer and was in his own way very, very cheerful. That's Friedrich Nietzsche. So for this, over to Michelle Greer.
Spoiler alert. I don't know how to do technology, so I don't have any props. And I have a cold, so just saying. All right, so this is a little riff on Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900. And he was a German philosopher and a cultural critic, infamous for his provocative and oftentimes ruthless attack on many of our classic or cherished traditional doctrines. It can be said that Nietzsche's concern to expose what he took to be the difficult problems generated by Enlightenment philosophy and the social and political trends of so-called modernity. Nietzsche rather unsystematically attempts to identify and catalog these problems by disclosing them as strategies which bespeak the advent of nihilism. Note that Nietzsche was writing at a time when the Enlightenment project was itself under scrutiny. The optimistic narratives according to which we could ground our morality, religion, natural science, political associations, and so on, in the sound deliverances of universal, impartial, and autonomous capacities of reason had taken its toll. The critical methodological procedures deployed during the Enlightenment, on the contrary, seem to have led to an abstract dogmatism and a correlative skepticism. With the challenge to the Enlightenment ideals, especially with respect to reason and the associated ideas of God and the soul, that is metaphysics, concerns about the meaning and value of human existence were on the increase. In particular, the young Nietzsche got his little hands on a copy of Arthur Schopenhauer's World as Will and Representation. In it, Schopenhauer presents an exquisitely and thoroughly convincing pessimistic worldview. Schopenhauer, an atheist, rejected the immortal soul. Human existence is not at bottom rational. Quite the contrary. It is merely the phenomenal expression of an underlying force, violent, insatiable, chaotic, and irrational. Human existence has no transcendent grounding in, say, a God creation story. It has no purpose. It has no goal. Stripped of the traditional comforts provided by, say, a God, life after death, progressive liberal politics, Schopenhauer concluded in the wake of the Enlightenment that human existence without purpose, value, or goal was essentially characterized by ultimately meaningless suffering. You live, you work, you suffer. You continuously seek to satisfy needs, to get ahead, perhaps to have a kid or two, to get respect, to get a raise, to go to Tahiti on a vacation for a week. For what? All around you see others succumbing to disease or want, pain and suffering, wars and violence, and you yourselves who live those things. You yourselves, if you are so terrifically unfortunate as to live long, will get old. Probably get infirm first and then get old and then die. Schopenhauer's existential and philosophical response to this was a kind of ascetic withdrawal. For this world is hell, and there is no escape hatch to be hoped for in the postulation of some merciful God or heaven, some wonderfully beatific beyond, where once and for all we might find satisfaction and freedom from the thraldom of having to live this wretched life. The highest manifestation of this ascetic desire for withdrawal from the world, according to Schopenhauer, could be found in the path of the saint, or as Nietzsche will call it, the ascetic priest, who seeks, according to Schopenhauer, perhaps the most appropriate response to our plight: deny the will to live altogether. In the meantime, cultivate an ethics not of goodness, for that has already been shown to be straight out, right? But an ethics of compassion and pity. Pity for your wounded, pathetic fellow sufferers, that is, all other mortals. One way to orient oneself towards Nietzsche is thus to ask a question. Is it possible in the aftermath of classical and modern Enlightenment philosophy to give up God and the immortal soul and the faith in pure reason as instruments for assigning meaning and value? Can we really give up these ideas and recognize that human existence is essentially fraught with transitoriness, finitude, suffering, and grief, and yet still nevertheless say yes to life? That is Nietzsche's general problem. Is it even possible for we moderns? Today I should like to focus on Nietzsche's critique of the moral interpretation of existence. More specifically, I shall focus on the idea of goodness. Nietzsche's comments on this topic span all throughout his writings, but a common place to look is his text on the genealogy of morals. The book is explicitly and aptly entitled A Polemic. Nietzsche aims to take on the entire monotheistic Judeo-Christian moral interpretation of our existence, one which calls into scrutiny the associated values attending to that tradition, the distinction between good and evil, the idea of the bad conscience, guilt, sin, and the traits which it requires and demands: selflessness, altruism, responsibility, pity. Nietzsche takes this entire constellation of ideas and requirements, these self-conceptions, to be nihilistic, to be signs of decadence and decay. Where did these values and ideas come from? What uncanny source has made the human, among all other animals, come to value self-abnegation, to deny its nature, to elevate pity, to denounce selfishness, to feel guilty about itself and its drives? Nietzsche thinks that morality is anti-nature. Against the biblical theological narrative, and against the Kantian narrative, and against the genealogies of the so-called British psychologists, including Mill, like the utilitarians, Nietzsche provides an alternative interpretation. Let us begin with goodness. What is good? What indeed is goodness? The first essay in the genealogy, entitled Good and Bad, Good and Evil, provides a new kind of account of our concepts of the good and thus goodness. Nietzsche has a very impressive and training in the classics. He's a classicist and a philologist, and so he naturally turns his attention to history and language to answer the question. What he finds is that originally the distinction between good and bad had a very non-moral origin. Surveying various and very different language families, he points out that at the beginning, so prehistory, at the beginning, the notion of the good merely referred to a kind of socio-economic class distinction. The aristocracy, the noble ones, the ruling classes deemed themselves to be good, meaning that they were joyfully accepting of their status. On the contrary, the bad simply referred to the oppressed classes, the less fortunate, the slave classes. This, according to Nietzsche, was not a moral distinction, but rather a cultural, class, socioeconomic distinction, sometimes indeed perhaps merely a physical distinction, as with the bad luck of those born with defects. No one was to be blamed, however, or had to go to hell for being bad in this sense. As with perhaps today, we hear that one has been unfortunate, lost in a fire or a hurricane or a war, that one came down with cancer or the pox. We think to ourselves without any malice, and with all the genuine concern we can muster, and we say to ourselves, and we whisper to one another, that's too bad. That's really, really too bad. Oh dear, I'm so sorry to hear that. And then we go off to the restaurants with our friends or the movie house and we move along. We do not blame them for their misfortune. We do not say the downtrodden must go to hell or be punished. These little bad, i.e. unfortunate ones, we don't even suffer with them. That is pity. It's just too bad. Shit happens. Compare this with the Judeo-Christian distinction between good and evil. To be evil, and not just as it were, too bad, is to be blameworthy. It is to deserve punishment and revenge. Evil is something altogether more sinister than the bad in the old sense. Evil is a moral evaluation. How did this new distinction get lodged into our vocabularies and our practices and our self-conceptions? How odd it is. How uncanny it was for Nietzsche. No other animal seems to institutionalize these specifically moral, judging, punishing, vengeful notions upon themselves and upon one another. Nietzsche suggests, again provocatively, that what happened is that the slave class, the oppressed, those long stepped over by the aristocratic classes, the hard-working ones without status, could only take it for so long. Within them festered a resentment and a suffering and an anger that the fortunate could never begin to understand. Alas, the slave class had no political power, no infrastructure, no means to fight back politically, no military power. They were not even legal subjects. They were powerless, outwardly. There was no way to vent their resentment and their rage and their feelings, outwardly. Thus commenced one of the most ingenious transformations and reversals of values hitherto. The slave classes were infected with ressentiment. The French word ressentiment is not the same as the English resentment. Ressentiment is altogether to like something deeper. It's more like depth psychology. It's something altogether more Dostoevskian, something altogether more creepy. It refers to the internalization and hatred and anger that cannot be outwardly expelled. A new mode of evaluating, a moral mode of evaluating came into being. A new weapon for those without weapons or power otherwise. What is the weapon? It's called morality. From one point of view, from the point of view of the oppressed, the slaves, the low, the rabble of society, came a new perspective. From that point of view, which is reactive, the previously good were taken to be evil. They were evil ones, sashaying around with all their status and their high airs and their happiness. Now, to be powerful and with status, to be what used to be good, well-constituted, noble, well, that now is seen from the perspective of the slave to be utterly evil. And the reversal continues. To be lowly, to be weak, powerless, to be oppressed and downtrodden, infirm, that was good, morally speaking. If revenge cannot be gotten here on this earthly existence, well, there is a promise and a balm for their suffering. You shall be rewarded later on, and they, The aristocratic, powerful, egotistical, prideful ones, they shall be in some long day from now ultimately punished, not just for a lifetime, but eternally in hell. The meek shall inherit the earth, for they alone are good. This transformation, this slave revolt in morality, carried with it, according to Nietzsche, an entire phantasmagoria of ideals. To enforce it over millennia required a number of props: the invention of a free will, a soul, punishment, torture, God, an afterlife, sin, forgiveness of sin. All fictions for Nietzsche. To be prideful, wealthy, to be aristocratic, to be powerful, to be on earth favored by circumstance, privilege. To be physically well constituted and sexual, to live according to earlier values, to be forgetful and joyful. Now these are evil. The good ones are meek. They value pity. Nay, they demand it. And they advocate and cultivate the elevation of the lowest ones, charity and good works. This is what is good. Everything else is selfish, forgetful, instinctive, and unruled by moral principles. This slave revolt in morality, and with it the new and gradual imposition of the increasingly Christian moral interpretation of existence, transformed the very notion of goodness. Subsequently, celebrations of being good were transformed into declarations of evil. And so, as Hegel had earlier argued in the phenomenology of Geist in his master-slave dialectic, the slave came out on top. Not by vanquishing the enemy, by power or political strength, but by a more cunning imposition of a moral interpretation of the human condition, one which transvalued the original values and moralized them. Morality and moral evaluations and judgments are better cops than the military, if you can get them going. It is difficult to discuss Nietzsche's conception of goodness without going into a host of other cultural, linguistic, socio-political issues and themes that he is interested in introducing. And indeed, if you read Nietzsche, you see that all of these different themes are constantly interwoven throughout his writings. And so you're getting like a really tiny little snapshot of one tiny little piece of Nietzsche's views on goodness. The traditional moral conception of goodness is not something to be accessed by the intellectual intuition or reason. And if we wish to look to see, as Nietzsche says, how ideals are manufactured on this earth, we might look into a darker origin and source, one that makes us feel less puffed up about how moral we are. We secular enlightened so-called men of knowledge might be dismayed by Nietzsche's account. Given his denial that our moral terms and ideals correspond to and reflect a subsistent true order of things, Nietzsche takes them to be historically generated interpretations or constructions. This, the Judeo-Christian interpretation, has not only ceased to motivate us, not only ceased to assign value and meaning to our existence, it has become the opposite. These values which elevate pity, charity, selflessness, and withdrawal actually diminish us. Their acceptance is a symptom of an underlying weakness and an enervation. He calls it decadence. Don't shoot the messenger. Nietzsche thus wants us to go beyond good and evil. He asseverates, though, by this I do not mean beyond good and bad. What he wants to do is get beyond the moralizing strategies. Doing so requires a shift from a moral to a non-moral, or perhaps even an immoral, mode of valuation. The question for Nietzsche is not whether these values are true, because they're not for him. The question is whether these values serve to affirm or deny life. I close with a quotation. What is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, Power is also a riff on Lebensgefühl. It's like the feeling of life, right? It's not like... What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that a resistance has been overcome.
Everybody settled? Anybody need something to drink? You want to get you a cookie or anything? You all good? I want to begin with acknowledging the place and my gratitude for being on the ancestral and unceded homeland of the Kumeyaay people, the Kumeyaay Nation, and to pay respects to the ancestors past, present, and future. And I think that's really important to sort of, for that statement to reorient a sense of place and a sense of grounding in the ground that I'm standing on, that we're sitting on, because being asked to come in and talk about a critique of the good from a perspective of decolonization, that's a very important foundation of that. Just what ground are you standing on? And I also wanted to thank especially my colleague Dr. Clack for the invitation to be on the Bah Humbug panel in the holiday season here. So, so thinking about the concept of goodness from the perspective of decolonization, decolonization typically has two general senses. One is formal political independence, like an actual historical moment or a historical condition when a formal colony is no longer under the control of that colonial power. And the other is more of a removal and replacing of the ideology or the mindset or the consciousness, the value system, the order that has been imposed through a process of colonization. So decolonization scholars like Linda Tahiwai Smith help break down that imposed, especially Anglo-European colonial ideology, thinking about its order and linearity of knowledge and imposed values and beliefs, as well as mandated actions that center and celebrate the colonizer and that which is colonial. So in terms of the two definitions, the United States has not actually achieved a state of political independence. Okay? The colonized groups in this land do not determine their own political, economic, and cultural will. So in terms of ethnic studies and in this conception of talking about the good, the work in those fields has largely been about the ideological and epistemological dimensions while trying to remove discrimination and violence from the state and civil society wherever that's possible. So I guess a major point then in thinking about the idea of the good is that dominant ideas of good and evil or good and bad support the settler state. Okay, so one piece of that is that difference and hierarchy are foundations of the settler state. And I wanted to just read a brief passage from one of my favorite texts, which is Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde writes, "Institutionalized rejection of difference is an absolute necessity in a profit economy, which needs outsiders as surplus people. As members of such an economy, we have all been programmed to respond to the human differences between us with fear and loathing, and to handle that difference in one of three ways: ignore it, and if that is not possible, copy it if we think it is dominant, or destroy it if we think it is subordinate. But we have no patterns for relating across our human differences as equals. As a result, those differences have been misnamed and misused in the service of separation and confusion." So there's a central question there. If the main structure is about defining difference, and here for Audre Lorde and within this colonial context, is difference is from that intersectional cluster of ideas that create gendered others or racial others or classed others. And the idea that not only is difference a real and fundamental thing, but that it is always hierarchical are fundamental pieces of it. And subjugating and assimilating or eliminating those who are marked as different is is a central characteristic of settler state and settler society. So whatever the settler ideology is, whether it's law and order or the peace, quote unquote the peace, I was fascinated. I'm teaching a course on African American civil rights next semester, and it was fascinating to me how often people who are protesting lynching or segregation or racism, the protesters who were countering those kinds of things were actually arrested in the South for disturbing the peace. That was the charge that was made against them. So thinking about the order of society and whether disrupting that order is considered good or permissible or valued. So whatever those settler ideologies are, the actions that are taken within support of the settler state can sometimes switch. So what I mean by that is things like murder and lying and assault and rape, stealing, all of these kinds of things can be permissible and sometimes even celebrated or lifted up if they are in support of the settler state. And so there are numerous examples of lynchings, violence under the color of law, failure to protect civil and human rights of those who are citizens or residents or neighbors because of their sexuality, their race, their citizenship status, poverty, and so on and so on. And we can think of many historical examples. We can think of genocide and manifest destiny, the longer historical arc, and the many examples that we unfortunately still see of the devaluing of life today. So in that sense, it's important to be really careful about the values of what is considered good and evil or good and bad in settler society. And so decolonization is about undoing those ideologies or the normalness of those concepts of the good. So again, decolonization is, this is a copy of Linda Tahiwai Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies. It's a book from the late 1990s and is considered very seminal in the field of decolonization studies. We were fortunate enough last year to have Professor Smith as a guest here in the Humanities Center as one of our NAP chairs, and many of our faculty and students and community members were able to work with her while she was in residence. But just to get a sense of the scope of her work and its importance, this book in particular and her work has been cited over 25,000 times. So many references, many people have read it and based, I think she's sort of shepherded multiple generations of scholars who are now out, the leading professors and the leading graduate students, scholars who are helping to advance knowledge around these areas. And in this text, she identifies several different ways that these projects, within an indigenous decolonizing context, these projects can work. They often work in terms of some form of reclaiming, regrounding, revitalizing, bringing back to life ways, values, stories, relationships, social structure, concepts of the cosmos, concepts of ethical values, and just the very act of remembering the history, remembering the relationships, remembering the knowledge. And so one example that I was kind of excited to work with in terms of a new scholar that I had a chance to hear her research. There's a scholar in Northern California named Cutcha Risling Baldy, who's working on, her book is called We Are Dancing for You, and it's essentially an analysis, a native feminism's analysis of the Hupa coming of age ceremony for girls, for young girls and young women. And in this particular ceremony, there's this process. She documents ethnographically her work with the multi-generational young women with their parents, with their community, where the community comes together and has several days, 3-4 days of ritual around acknowledging it's generally around the first menstruation, and it's generally around this idea of the coming of womanhood, the expectations of women within the Hupa context, the language, the rituals around the costuming, the adornments, the actual ritual procedures, and that's one example where The stories are that it went from the community having basically no knowledge or not really remembering those rituals to now it's a point where young women are really looking forward to and asking about when they're going to have a chance to go through their own coming of age recognition and ceremony. So. So in that sense, so those who are in the process, the process of colonization and decolonization really has those two aspects to it. One can be viewed as critical or understanding and unpacking the effects and the mechanisms of the experiences that people have had, and the other is the constructive or actually finding something to replace it. Because if all you're doing is rejecting or trying to reverse a concept of the good, then and you don't have something to replace that with, you don't have a foundation, you don't have a ground to stand on, you don't have a language, you don't have a sense of self, or you don't have a sense of community to replace it with, then you're really not in much of a better position. You're simply more aware of the damage that's been done, but you're not really restoring or recovering or coming back. So these are just some comments that I wanted to sort of open up about the concept of decolonization and how it might, really how it's imperative from a concept of decolonization for us to think critically about what we consider to be good and how we think of those who would challenge the state or the society and the culture. So I think I'll stop with that and leave further discussion for questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We've had a kind of a very varied set of ideas here. So we've got about 15 minutes. There's a chance for some questions from the floor. Yeah. Phil.
Yeah. Thank you for your lectures. I want to ask a question particularly about Schopenhauer. I mean, I agree with his ontological misalignment. So but I would call it ontological parallax, because alignment means that there's a place and you're aligned with. But I have a completely different conclusion. It is because of this ontological parallax that, in a sense, humanity has the ability and the responsibility to resist a misalignment, right? And that's where virtue comes in, because it's beyond just existing. It's like acting in virtue. If things were already in line, everything is good, one does not have to be virtuous. Just one just exists and everything is good, right? But also this resistance means that one is striving for a kind of arete also, which is the other meaning of good, right? Because you're looking for a better way to align your life or align society or whatever. So resistance is a very important aspect, because it's this misalignment that allows us to truly be human beings, to go beyond mere existence into another realm. So in some ways, it's a little bit like Nietzsche, but I put more emphasis on the human aspect of the virtue of resistance. And I think that's why it's necessary for us as individuals call out the misalignment that are there, because the mere act of resistance is the beginning of finding a new axis for existence. Not that you necessarily will succeed, but the fact that you are actually looking for a new axis means that you are becoming human. You are human. So could you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, we can have a go. I think that's really interesting. One thing that I like it a lot. I think you're right, actually. Well, one of the things that comes to mind is, let's say there was a perfect alignment. I mean, Schopenhauer even addresses this. There's a gorgeous passage in the Parega where he says, imagine a world in which lovers did always find one another, and there was never any struggles or obstacles to overcome, and turkeys ran around ready roasted. He says we would just die of boredom.
Or hang ourselves.
Oh, hang ourselves, yeah. That's right. It's actually more
Hang
active than
ourselves
this.
or-
We hang ourselves.
Or die of boredom.
Yeah. That kind of life would be unbearable. So the weird thing about Schopenhauer is it's unbearable one way or the other for him. It's either misaligned and it's unbearable, or it's aligned and it's,
Boring.
yeah, and unbearable. Your suggestion is an interesting one, that somehow there's the friction, sort of creative friction that comes about as a result of ourselves finding ourselves in a world that doesn't meet our expectations. And it's that kind of friction that can produce presumably things like great art, great poetry, character development, and so on. Now, and you had a whole range of things in addition to that.
Well, the corollary to that too is like, happiness is not necessarily the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
Right? Because in fact, it is suffering that allows you to, in a sense, endure this unhappiness, to strive for something deeper. And that's why we always think of mere happiness as just sort of to something be frivolous.
Yeah. So did you want to add anything to it?
No, I mean, I don't, I think Schopenhauer would not be convinced by it, but I do think that it resonates a little bit more with perhaps Nietzsche, who does argue in behalf of the sort of creative power of resisting. For him, freedom is a feeling of overcoming obstacles, and without that, that is precisely how one becomes what one is. And so I think that sounds more, believe it or not, Nietzschean, right? Because he has that kind of conception of, and he would also deny that happiness is the goal. For him, happiness is something desired by Democrats, Englishmen, and cows. Okay? The goal is not to be happy. The goal is to, essentially live well. Or, so that's, I would just add that.
I would just add one more thing. And then, do you want to add anything to this one?
Tag in, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, one of the I know you weren't putting it in these terms, but a kind of theological move on this is and of course this dovetails very much with discussions that we had about the problem of evil and theological responses to the problem of evil. Theologians will very frequently say things like, well, in order to develop as a person, you need to address challenges, difficulties. Yeah, that's right, probably. The kind of thing that Schopenhauer would want to draw our attention to is where it's too neat. That if I come into the world as a little clacklet, and then I encounter certain problems and I grow and develop as a person. Schopenhauer wants to alert our attention to those cases where challenges don't allow you to grow, don't allow you to develop. The friction isn't a creative one. You're overwhelmed by them. You die early on, or you descend into mental illness, or you're just blasted by poverty and the lack of opportunity. So without taking away the importance of human, which I think is really, really important, there are ways in which we might think, okay, that friction, or the parallax as you call it, may still blast our lives in a way that makes us say, the world, this isn't a good thing. Jess?
Well, I just wanted to respond to the point you were making more by associating in one of my favorite concepts from Audre Lorde, which is how she deals with silence. And so for Audre Lorde, especially for women's experience, for basically people who are marginalized or others, they're not invited or welcome to speak from their experience, right? So silence is, you're just supposed to sort of suffer in silence. And for her, the taking the step to actually find the language to express your reality, right? To speak out against that having been silenced or closed down, for her is kind of this really huge piece of her philosophy. And so it's just the way that you were asking, the comment and question it, I just saw that connection and wanted to bring that up, because that's, and what I think is also really important about Audre Lorde is she's making her comment very specific to especially the experience of African American women. So she's putting it not just in a sort of universal, general human context, but to the very specific particularities of those who are marginalized through sexism, racism, homophobia, and these very forms of oppression that cause people to not speak their truth. But for her, very much that garnering that courage to realign yourself with what you're experiencing and feeling and voice it and express it, for her is really kind of this very high value she places on it. She calls that poetry. Yeah.
Interesting. Any other questions? Yeah, great.
You mentioned how John Wells said that one of the attributes were a predominance of activism over passivity. Could you explain more why that would lead to more?
Yeah, that's a line from Mill that always puzzles me. I think he means that you want to have a life where you're in charge of what happens rather than things happening to you, so that you feel that you're not, a leaf caught in the wind, that you've somehow said, yeah, I'm going to do this, rather than this happens and takes me along with it. It seems to be something to do with a sense of control rather than helplessness. But I may be misinterpreting that passage. Do you read it that way?
I don't know.
Does that get to what you were?
Yeah, it was just like it was kind of stuck out to me when I read it, because I didn't know if he meant more just even the act of, participating was what made it happiness, or if it's like what you said, you have to have some type of control over it in order to.
I think it's about control to the extent that's possible, autonomy, self-creativity, a self-driven nature of enjoyment. Mike, you know this text well. Would you read it that way?
No, I think you got that right, yeah. I read it the same way you do.
Okay, good, thank you. Anyone else?
I have a different question. Interesting, and forgive me if this is a bit rambling, but listening to Jesse's presentation, you would get this sense that the objectives of, say, decolonization, whether theoretical or practical, kind of aims towards some type of good, or some type of equity or justice that needs to be kind of reestablished or recalibrated in the world. There are complicating questions as to how we're going to kind of conceptualize that notion of the good or the just, or even if we want to talk about something like the good or the just. Assuming that we don't, right? We can kind of run this whole thing back to Hobbes, and then I'm back into Nietzsche and the Schopenhauer territory, and now I'm kind of I'm going to be in a paradox of some sort, right? So Hobbes denies the final good, or denies that there's anything called the summa bonum, or the greatest good or virtue, and after that, then we kind of descend into this life where what determines the good and the bad is always the kind of general power structures that happen to take place in the way that Nietzsche describes them, the genealogy of morals, and what determines the quality of life then determines the absence of suffering, right? So there's no greatest good, there's only a greatest evil that's to be avoided, and that's to be death. And so for Hobbes, there isn't any happiness, there's just this kind of rat race of trying to kind of be sated, or that is to say satisfied, which is not actually the same as happy. And I'm just kind of wondering where all three of these thinkers might be situated along the line of the question is what are we to make of human affairs in the absence of anything called the good?
Do you mean the moral good or the good-bad distinction? The natural?
Yeah, the moral good, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's a fascinating question, Mike.
Nietzsche thinks that it opens up a possibility, because he thinks religion is a system of cruelty, punishment, and judgment. He thinks that if we can get beyond good and evil, it opens up the possibility of a more naturalistic account, one which does not involve a kind of self-directed self And he by no means wants to get rid of the distinction between good and bad, right? But he wants to avoid that, what has come to devalue itself, the moral distinction between good and evil. So he would applaud getting beyond it, right? Which isn't to say get beyond the distinction between good and bad, or good and what is good. He gives a natural, almost a bodily account, whatever maximizes or heightens the feeling of life, right? So that would be Nietzsche's good. So,
Sure. Thank you for that very provocative question. Yeah, and thank you for listening at that level, where because I would think I was trying to do the same thing of listening to each paper and trying to sort out the through lines with them. So I really appreciate that question. Thank you for that. In my understanding, I would probably respond saying that decolonization is going to be inherently suspicious of just the move to universalize morality, right? Because that's going to be tied more to these universalizing, totalizing narratives that your Linda T.Y. Smith, for instance, says, like, this is exactly how the mind has worked, where history is totally accounted for by the experience of Europeans writing that history, and really nothing else exists. So there's definitely not necessarily like the first step that you took to kind of then try to generalize is not necessarily one that the decolonizing thinkers would do. And in that sense, so I think it's a little slightly different question. Your question was, so how do we think about social and human relationships with the absence of a kind of shared, perhaps, concept of the good? And I think some of that's to be TBD, right? It's to be determined by if you've got this set of inequitable power relationships that there really isn't a moral equivalence around, like there is, or equivocacy, right? There's no sense of like, well, we just are where we are, so let's just, all bets are off, let's just make the best of it. It's no, there were precise things that happened that were destabilizing, that were wrong, and we're going to kind of go back to the best of our ability, remember those things, and pick up what we can moving forward. That at least creates whatever basis you would have for deciding a stable moral position would be to just sort of recognize and acknowledge actual historical events and actual displacements. And then when it's this process of recovery, restoration, there's a bit of it shouldn't be like us in this room, for instance, determining what is the collective good for like Kumeyaay people, right? None of us are Kumeyaay, none of us are from here. So I think it requires a very different set of social relationships that actually centers colonized folks and centers the voices, or maybe in the case of Audre Lorde, it would be that centers women's voices, the voices of women who are lesbian, who are of color, who are, and then just sort of like allowing whatever social process happens from there to determine what we consider to actually be a collective good, rather than sort of theorize it and impose it upon people without listening to them.
I know I spoke before, but could I add?
Well, I think we had another answer to that.
It's going to take me just a couple of seconds. I'm going to respond by thinking about how Freud would think about your response. This is a relatively, more than relatively bleak outlook on the world, but in his more positive moments, he talks about this, the recognition of the badness of things, leading us to, he has this phrase, we need to take the fight to nature. And for Freud, and this is, this requires a lot of critique, but the idea is that his nature, and it's terrible. Civilization is the thing that sort of saves us, and that brings a whole host of different problems. But we can combine our strength and try and make things tolerable. That's the active thing. The more despairing thing for him is just we've got to find ways to cope. The human situation here is so difficult. You just find a way to cope, and this can be, as I say, it can go from the whole range of you flee into the arms of some kind of religious faith, which for him is always illusory, of course. You find romantic love. You collapse into what he calls the condition of chronic intoxication. But these things, however you can cope, he's very, very fond of a statement from Frederick the Great. is that in my state, when he was a ruler of Germany, in my state, every man can be saved after his own fashion, which means you take whatever works for you to make it tolerable. Here, this is about coping again. The line from the myth of Sisyphus, which I'm sure you know well, the important thing is not to be cured, but to live with one's ailments. We can't look for a solution to this problem. We can look for a Band-Aid that will keep us going until the end, which will be terrible. I think there's elements of Freud here. There's the one which is like, let's try as hard as we can to try and make, and Freud's denial of religious faith, of course, partly had that kind of Marxist element to it, which is you get rid of the illusory world, you can focus your attention on building a better world. Here, that's Freud in his more radical moments. Politically he's odd. Sometimes he's sort of, along with the Marxists, most of the time he's a very conservative person, and a despairing, empirical conservative at that. I don't know. That's where I think he would go on that.
Yeah, that's great. It's just really helpful for me to hear like what some of the kind of like positive responses would be to like a space and place where like, you know, whatever thing that we would kind of ordinarily call the good seems to be either like denied or in serious question for social political reasons. And so the alternatives are just really helpful to hear in terms of like how we go forward or what the intent is. So thank you for the answers. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Phil, did you want to add one little point in?
If
Go.
you want to ask
Yeah.
a question first, go
Please.
ahead.
Okay, I was just going back to Professor Mills for a second, that I wanted to ask, to me it seems like a higher good and like an objective good would be kind of an antidote to colonialization, in that rather than a specific group determining what the good is for everyone, or us, like you said, sitting here theorizing the good, not claiming that we know what the objective good is, but a collective pursuit of the objective good, would that like not allow groups to dominate others if we can agree that there is if there is the good, then I can't use my good to oppress someone else. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and if I'm hearing, I think I'm understanding, and I think I'm hearing you correctly. So if what I say doesn't answer your question, please re-ask it. But historically, what has happened was a small group deciding for everybody what the collective good is, right? So the process of actually creating, recreating relationships, like, so this might be within an indigenous context, like relationships, self-relationships and group relationships within a community that has been decimated through genocidal policy, for instance, or along the kind of the race and gender and sexuality line of like an Audre Lorde. It's like a group of people who may not all be in the same space with the exact same lineage or heritage, but sort of as a group have been defined and then not allowed to participate in a conversation around a collective good. If I understand what you're saying, that is the contention, is to actually change a process where a very small group is deciding for everybody what the good is, right? So you have a very narrow number of references in terms of who you're actually even like citing or talking about, and whose voices are lifted up in terms of defining the good, to actually allowing real living people, many of whom are different or defined as other, to actually be alive in a process of deciding what is good. So that's what I think the arguments are. Was I misunderstanding your question?
Yep, that's a good answer.
Okay. Good question.
Jessica.
I was wondering, Michelle, how much of Nietzsche you think there is in Ayn Rand?
There might be a little bit of Nietzsche in Ayn Rand. Although, there might be. I'd have to think. I'm thinking of like Atlas Shrugged or Fountainhead or something. And I don't know her essays and so on, so I'm just going back from my 20s when I read Ayn Rand and the novels. I understand that kind of philosophical egoism and self-interest is something that Nietzsche would not have a problem with in many ways. Surprisingly enough, Nietzsche was a very gentle person. He just donned these masks when he's writing and takes it on, because he takes these values to need to be overthrown because they are oppressive and diminishing. But he doesn't, I guess I would say there might be a lot of Nietzsche and Rand, or a lot of Ayn Rand and Nietzsche, or however you want to do it, because Nietzsche has no problem with the individual legislating for self. And Nietzsche has no problem. In fact, some of his historical, I can't believe he did, some of his historical, world historical individuals that he thought really did sort of establish something were Napoleon and Caesar. Then he also, of course, likes Goethe. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I could see where you could make a case for it. What do you think?
Well, it sounds like it insofar as you're privileging self over, what is good for the self and what is good for society.
Nietzsche thinks that society is, he kind of refers to it as a herd, that individuals tend to become, and the ideals that are motivating us generate a kind of conformism and oppress the individual, and that the whole promotion of the species is going to have to be by a few world historical individuals who will legislate the future, right?
So society can oppress the individual, or individuals can oppress society?
I don't think he takes it that way. I don't think he takes it to be oppressing society. I think he can think that certain ideals that get institutionalized can tend over time to begin to generate conformity and a lack of a kind of oppression of its own kind. So he's fighting back, right? He's fighting back. He longs for the philosopher of the future, the one who can legislate for, and generate something which he thinks would be a more healthy set of ideals. He longs for the transvaluation of all values. He's not interested in being stuck in just a kind of selfish individualism. So if you read more of his writings, you see that it's really a kind of a mixture of a lot of different kinds of interests. I don't think he's interested in the individual oppressing society. The strong individual doesn't need to.
Interesting. Now, we could continue this conversation for a long time, but we are actually over time.
Oh.
So I would love to thank you all for your excellent comments and questions and for being here today. Last time next week. Last one. Come and have a...